This short video explores how and why we focus on racial disparities when thinking about racial equity and racial justice within our criminal justice system. It also looks at the history of legal challenges to practices and laws that target one ethnic group. If it troubles you when our criminal justice system targets a particular ethnic group, and I think it should trouble you, if you believe there should be legal challenges to such practices and laws when they exist, then you have the dirty laundry, and I literally mean the dirty laundry, of men like this to thank. What do I mean by all this? So, in the 1840s, a large number of mostly but not exclusively white men moved to what is now California, hoping to strike it rich in the gold rush. And while they were perfectly willing to do the difficult work of mining for gold, what they weren't willing to do was their own laundry, because that was women's work and they weren't going to touch it as single men. And this opened up the possibility for commercial laundries. For a while, in fact, all the dirty laundry was shipped from California to Taiwan and then weeks later came back clean. But what eventually happens is that in Chinatowns throughout California and in urban areas throughout America, including in New York City, Chinese laundries open up. And this is because the Chinese had found their economic mobility in other industries and professions blocked by either racism or laws, but not in laundries. This was something Americans were willing to let the Chinese do. So Chinese laundries in urban America become a thing, as we might say. But there was a catch. White Americans, or Americans more broadly, didn't much like the Chinese. This is a drawing from a popular weekly in 1874, comparing the Chinese racially to chimpanzees and pigs, suggesting an evolution working it backwards. This is a political cartoon from a popular satirical weekly, The Wasp. And The Wasp argued here that the Chinese must go, that California had to expel all of its Chinese and focused on the role of the Chinese in the laundry industry. And so in 1880, the city of San Francisco criminalized operating a laundry out of a wooden building, even though most buildings in San Francisco at the time were wooden, without a permit from the city government. And on its face, this law doesn't mention any racial group. It is, as we say in legal studies, race neutral. Nothing about this law specifies the Chinese or any other racial group. On its face, the law is race neutral, but the application of the law was anything but. So, for example, you'll see that of the 80 whites who applied for a license for their laundry, all of those applications were accepted. In contrast, of the 200 Chinese who applied for a laundry license, all but one was rejected. And the Supreme Court found in Yik Wu v. Hopkins that even when a law is race neutral, if in the application of the law it targeted one ethnic or racial group, this would be a violation of the Constitution's 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection to all residents, not just citizens, but all residents. And in fact, Yi Lik, who was the owner of the Yik Wu Laundry, was himself not a citizen, but he takes the case along with the help of a guild of Chinese launderers in San Francisco all the way to the Supreme Court to protect his economic livelihood. And the logic of that Supreme Court case animates much of our discussion of racial justice within our criminal justice system today. So here, for example, is a recent Twitter posting by Captive Voices, a decarceration group out of New Jersey, and they point out that although only 14% of New Jersey's population is African American, 61% of New Jersey's prison population is African American. Here's a similar graphic from Massachusetts ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, pointing out that While 22%, only 22% of Massachusetts is Black or Latinx, nearly 6 out of 10 people behind bars in Massachusetts is Black or African or Latino. And all of these graphics suggest that there's something racist going on in the application of the law, that there is an unconstitutional racial disparity within the criminal justice system. But the analysis of racial disparities within the criminal justice system is not as straightforward as these graphics might suggest. Let me walk you through an example, a hypothetical example. Let's imagine that 12% of the US population is Etruscan. Etruscans were an ancient civilization in what is now Italy. There are no Etruscans in the United States, Italy, or anywhere else in the world. So let's imagine that 12% of the US population is Etruscan, but 22% of those that we arrest for the crime of assault are Etruscan. This graphic might suggest, because of the disparity between the population of Etruscans and the share of those who arrested for assault who are Etruscan, that there is an anti-Etruscan bias in the application of the law. Look, if only 12% of the US is Etruscan, but 22% of those that we arrest for assault is Etruscan, then clearly the criminal justice system has an anti-Etruscan bias. But that logic makes sense if and only if all members of all ethnic groups commit crimes at exactly the share of their percentage of the population. If there's 12% of Etruscans, then 12% of all people committing the crime of assault must be Etruscan. But if different groups offend at different rates, then a population analysis doesn't make much sense. What if people commit crimes at a higher rate or a lower rate than their share of the population? So let's add a piece of data here. 12% of the US population is Etruscan. 22% of those that we arrest for assault are Etruscan, but 30%, hypothetically, of those who commit assault are Etruscan, as identified by the victims. Now we have a very different analysis. Because Etruscans might commit the crime of assault more frequently than their share of the population, this data point suggests that we're actually under-arresting Etruscans. 30% of those committing the crime of assault are Etruscan, but only 22% of those that we arrest are Etruscan. So the choice of what statisticians call benchmarks really matter. A benchmark is the comparison group. So should we compare the percentage of those that we arrest for assault against the population, a population benchmark? Or should we compare it to what might we call a behavioral benchmark, the share of those committing the crime of assault who are Etruscan? Our choice of benchmark profoundly shapes the outcome of our analysis. Choose one benchmark or another, you might get very different results. I want to make a little sidebar here and return to the anti-Asian sentiment that drove much of the Yik Woo case, because it's easy to forget how widespread throughout the Americas, not just the United States, but throughout the Americas was anti-Asian sentiment. So this is the title or the cover page for a 1934 book, El Ejemplo de Sonora, The Example of Sonora, by Jose Angel Espinosa. And Espinosa argued in this rather popular book that Mexico as a nation could not progress unless it kicked out all Mexicans of Chinese origin. Here's an image from within the book suggesting graphically, visually, that the Chinese were vectors of disease. Notice the exaggerated racial features in the nose and lips that so closely resembles the imagery, the racist imagery of African Americans in the United States at the time. Here's another image, supposedly instructing Mexicans what would happen if Mexican women were to marry Chinese men. They would be left destitute, and their children would be fatherless because the Chinese man would abandon them and they would be left poor and society would collapse. One way to think about a ejemplo de sonora is that it's a Mexican Mein Kampf. Hitler's tract arguing for the killing of all Jews within Germany, a final solution of the Jewish problem. This is arguing that the solution to the Chinese problem in Mexico was to kick them all out, or worse. These weren't just ideas. They had profound and violent consequences for the Chinese in Mexico. This is an article from the British magazine The Guardian, and we always provide you a link when we provide you a citation, when we provide you information from sources, discussing the 1911 anti-Chinese massacre in the Mexican city of Torreon, where the Mexican army, along with residents of the city of Torreon, slaughtered 300 out of 600 Chinese residents in the city. This is another image from that same article, the Chinese bodies being carted away. And Mexico has been slow to acknowledge its long history of anti-immigrant sentiment, perhaps because Mexico as a nation sends so many immigrants to places like the United States. This is a newspaper article from the Mexico News Daily covering a recent museum exhibit about the massacre and the subsequent cover-up of the massacre, because Mexico has been slow to acknowledge this long history of anti-Asian immigrant sentiment. And if you are interested in the history of anti-Asian racism within Mexico or Latin America more broadly, because it happens in multiple countries, I strongly recommend Jason Oliver Chang's book, Chino. But to return our topic at hand here, when thinking about racial or ethnic disparities within our criminal justice system, a critical question to ask is, what kind of benchmark should we use? A population benchmark, 12% of America is Etruscan, or behavioral benchmark, 30% of perpetrators of assault are Etruscan? Because the analysis and our conclusions might be very different depending on our choice of benchmark.